Whenever someone sits down to watch a show, they're making either a conscious or unconscious decision, a trade of their time, attention, energy, and in many cases money for the possibility of consuming something that is satisfying and worth it. There are tons of things you can analyze and look at in media, but ultimately it comes down to that singular question. Were you satisfied with that trade? Now, where this gets tricky is when a piece of media takes time to really come together. There are multiple shows I almost stopped watching that in retrospect became some of my favorites. And one of those, I finished the first season of last night, a show people have told me to watch time and time again that really is fantastic. Dungeon Meshi, otherwise known as Delicious in Dungeon, is an incredibly popular recent release. One of two parts that seem to indicate a traditional fantasy revival. And something I've said a couple times in recent videos is that I have a pretty strong bias against this genre. I have a huge inclination to dislike this style of fantasy, yet somehow, having spent the last 12 months predominantly talking about Frieren Beyond Journey's End, I once again find myself enraptured by a traditional fantasy story. This show is really good, and I almost didn't watch it. Welcome to a new running series where we'll be exploring Dungeon Meshi. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when a story's fantastic charm and depth takes a little bit of time. Today's video is brought to you by Skillshare. This is a recurring partnership I'm very grateful for because as a product, it runs so much in line with things I believe. Skills are developed through effort and guidance, and our time is valuable. Skillshare helps you develop those skills and reduce resistance through a wide range of different classes. Art, business, organization, there are tons of options. Skillshare's large variety of courses available help you find a good fit. So often when using online resources to learn, it's hard to curate for your own skill level. That information is available on Skillshare front and center. For me, I've been fixated on classes talking about writing, like Mila Goldberg's Creative Writing Bootcamp. These courses are led by a variety of different people, some of which are professionals and educators with very real-world experience, like being a best-selling author. This leads to a lot of grounded, practical advice. Pair that with the fact that many Skillshare courses allow you to submit work for feedback from other students and teachers, and you have a pretty good formula for learning a new skill. If this is something that stands out to you, the first 500 people to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive 20% off their first year of Skillshare. This is in addition to a 7-day free trial and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Get started today. Thanks again to Skillshare. Now back to the video. It took me a while of slowly chipping through the first half of Dungeon Meshi before it finally stuck. For me, there's a depth and charm to this story that took a while to sink in. I think part of the aversion was its initial episodic feel. I feel like the quality of a show has to be really high for me to be interested in episodic style. I prefer stories that are built around character arcs and growth, starting in one place and ending in another. But there are many shows where characters end up in the exact same place they started by the end of an episode. I actually plan on doing an entire video on this topic at some point, when shows transition from episodic to serial and do it really well. But today I want to talk about more than just that. I want to focus on Dungeon Meshi's weird and charming cast and its distinct style, and why I think this show, more than almost any other anime I've watched, deserves an audience that'll stick through it to the end. The initial thing that makes this show so interesting is its island of misfit toys cast. It follows a classical fantasy party, an oddball group of career dungeon explorers, who find themselves in a really tricky position. In this world, there's a magical veil over dungeons, tying the souls of the dead to their bodies, allowing magic users to come along and bring them back to life. Now to do this, there's two parts: necessary resources to cast the magic, and the dead body. Meaning, if you don't have access to that body, you can't bring them back. Which is where our story starts, with 3 underfunded, understaffed party members who are going back in to save someone they lost. Their lack of preparation and resources is what leads to the primary gimmick of the show, having to survive off meals created from the monsters they kill. Delicious in Dungeon. Now these characters are so far from Mary Sue's. They're all flawed, initially not very charismatic, and in a very stressful situation. A majority of the anime I really love is built around characters that grow on the audience. Most people learning to write are given a general set of parameters that characters and protagonists should follow. As a general rule, stories do well when characters are easy to root for. First impressions are important, especially for the primary cast. Sometimes to the point where in an attempt to make a character easy to root for, they end up not really making a character at all, creating protagonists and side characters that, while appealing on the surface, are two-dimensional and offer very little depth or progression. Character flaws are incredibly important, but if they're used with a heavy hand, it can make it difficult for audiences to connect. which was my initial impression of the ensemble cast in Dungeon Meshi. A weird mix of archetypal and abnormal. But that same trait is part of what makes them feel so singular, because the weird, non-conforming parts of these characters are central components of what makes them so charming. I'm not arguing that everyone will like these characters, just that they have a texture to them that's so interesting. Take the protagonist Laios, for example. He's someone that struggles to relate to and connect with those around him. Socializing is unintuitive, and he finds himself fascinated by monsters in the dungeon. Now, this doesn't prevent him from trying to connect with his fellow adventurers. He's quirky and flawed, which leads to fascinating solutions and problems. There's this running bit that's a fun example. When presented with monsters that are adjacent or related to canines, Laios takes the black bear approach, fully committing to intimidating them by embodying a more ferocious dog. It's charming and quirky and fun. It's in line with Laios' character, and also deeply in touch with the central gimmicks of the story. Dungeon Meshi is a show that masterfully dips between serious and comedic elements, and part of what makes it special is that these two components work to complement one another. At first, this seems like a lighthearted episodic show that's built around this central gimmick premise, and it is, but it's also more than that, and not at all in a way that denies its roots. To me, it felt like the story evolves. Each character's little quirks turn out to be fundamental to their entire character arc. There's a dungeon-dwelling dwarf who loves making cuisine from the local monsters and caring for the ecosystem. That's important later. Or the nerdy, awkward magician elf, skilled in school but seemingly inexperienced in the dungeon, someone dead set on innovating and fascinated by theory. The writing effortlessly reuses components that were introduced earlier in the story in interesting ways later, which is actually really on brand with the themes of the story. And part of what comes with making characters like this is you end up with an ensemble that doesn't really feel like any other story you've watched before. Because kind of an inherent part of weird characters done well is they'll end up being very different than other things you've seen. Which leads to our next part, this story's charm. I love when stories sell me on characters I initially kinda didn't like. It's part of why I enjoyed shows like Kaguya-sama Love is War or Frieren Beyond Journey's End so much. When I'm not sold or immediately intrigued in a character, but then down the road I find them fascinating, that's a cool experience. There's this quote from Brandon Sanderson about magic systems that's along the lines of, "The stuff that magic can't do is more interesting than the stuff it can." It kind of argues that limitations are a major component in what brings depth out of magic. I think this is true of characters too. Interesting flaws are a great way to explore a character's texture, because while most protagonists are trying to do good in the world or be a hero, their flaws more often define them. Many writers argue that conflict and struggle is the core of any story, the roadblocks and problems a character faces in their pursuit. There's this book I've been reading called The Fantasy Fiction Formula by an author named Deborah Chester. She argues that antagonists and protagonists should be built around give or take 6 personality traits you feel very strongly about. Protagonists have a majority positive traits with a couple negatives, and antagonists have the inverse. I think a lot of stories generally follow this structure, but in Dungeon Meshi, the characters feel more 50-50, a mix of positive and negative, some traits that are admirable and endearing and others that are heavily off-putting. The magic is that both of these end up serving towards the character's charm. When I looked up Dungeon Meshi video essays on YouTube, I found that a majority of them, mostly from one channel, were deep dives on different characters in the story. So I don't think I'll be alone when I say the characters in Dungeon Meshi are outstanding, but I think that's far from the only thing it offers. Dungeon Meshi has a remarkably distinct style, and I'm not just referring to its animation and art direction. I'm also talking about its writing. It demonstrates that show, don't tell isn't always the way you have to approach storytelling. It has this remarkable fantasy world that's subtle and grounded. And while the magic would be interesting in a vacuum, it ultimately serves the story. It is a show that also does something that I've praised time and time again in my videos about Frieren. It finds a new, interesting lens to look through when approaching classical fantasy trope. It's almost like you're on a safari with the characters, except instead of looking at exotic animals, you're looking at magical ones. Now earlier I said I wasn't only referring to the animation and art direction, but I was also referring to the animation and art direction. Dungeon Meshi's style comes across beautifully in exaggerated movements and beautiful stills. There's a fantastic mix between simplicity and attention to detail. Its color design is the type of quality that goes unnoticed. I think that's actually something you could say about the entire show, Its quality is subtle. It's not ever present and it sneaks up on you. But when you think back on key moments, there's so many that stand out. If I were to simplify why I enjoyed this show so much and why I want to make this running series, it's because it's a piece of art that feels very unique. While there are tons of shows I want to compare to it, there's no substitute. Take for example another anime I really love, Skip and Loafer. It's one of my all-time favorites because of how good it is, but I do think that other high-quality romance anime are comparable. They fill a similar spot in my brain. Whereas Dungeon Meshi is just very different. And not just that, but it does it in a very subtle way. Maybe it's because I talk about anime on YouTube, but there's something about well-done novelty that appeals to me so much. When a story comes along and does something different in a way that's not only surprising, but also feels like it'll last. I think that's really cool. Like there'll never be someone who comes along and does it the same. So I'm really excited to add this show into the mix of weekly releases. I will be making more videos about Frieren and talking about Dungeon Meshi and even mixing in some that are completely unrelated. I'm just surprised at how, as I sit with this show and think back on it, it mirrors the experience I had while watching it. A delayed charm, one that's brought me a lot of joy and makes me think. I have quite a few ideas written up already, but if you have any, feel free to leave a suggestion. Thanks for exploring this with me. I'll see you all next week.